welcome to the Capital Group's YouTube channel. I'm Kevin FitzPatrick, Senior Partner at the Capital Group and CEO of the Government Technology Insurance Company. We hope that everyone had a nice summer. This is the first in our fall series of webinars, and today we'll be discussing the new Biden Executive Order 14042. We'll talk you through the specifics of 14042, who in your organization needs to be vaccinated, how to implement the COVID-19 vaccination plan, and measures for employee non-compliance. We're joined today by our panel of legal experts, Andrew Beardall, Attorney Extraordinaire and Chief Operating Officer of the Government Technology Insurance Company, longtime Capital Group partner, Kathy Goyne, CEO of OpsPro. OpsPro is your go-to back room for everything HR in the world of federal contracting. We have about an hour together today. We'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts on our YouTube chat. Please send them in. So with that, we're going to go ahead and dig right in, and I'm going to turn things over to Andrew Beardall here to kick us off. Andrew, take it away.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, everybody. So we are here to talk about the plan out of the pandemic, which the president announced back earlier in the month of September. And this primarily involves federal contractors and other large companies and vaccination mandates, and then some of the ancillary things that go with it. Now, today, we're going to be focusing on the federal contracting aspect of it. Please be aware that there are plenty of other aspects that are a part of this plan, but we are going to try and address the ones that directly impact federal contractors, because I believe that's what most of the audience that we have here is. Above and beyond that, you have to realize that this is a rapidly changing target. Though some guidance has come out, there's always more guidance coming out. So you have to maintain your vigilance and be abreast of what is going on the state, federal, and local levels to make sure that your company is compliant. Now, there are twin goals to this that the Biden administration is pushing for. One is the safety of federal contractors and folks in the federal workplace. The other goal is to get as many Americans vaccinated as possible. Now, we're not going to be talking about the merits or the legalities of this. I know that there is a wide variety of opinions. What we're addressing is what is written as of now and what companies have to comply with. We know that there are court challenges out there. The state of Arizona has already filed some, as are many other states. But we're trying to take a snapshot of the here and now. So assuming that the rule and the guidance stands as written, this is what you as federal contractors will have to comply with going forward. But just remember, everything's subject to change. There's always new material coming out. So what we are going to talk about here first off is what is the primary core issue here, and that is the vaccination of covered contract employees. Now, those words are a little loaded, so let's talk about it. First off, vaccination. You have to get the shot or shots. If you use Pfizer and Moderna, you've got to get both shots. If you use J&J, you've got to get the one shot. And who does this apply to? Covered contract employees. Well, the long story short is if you are a federal contractor, then this includes you. It doesn't matter if you're a two-person organization. It doesn't matter if you're a 20,000-person organization. If you have a federal contract or subcontract, this applies to you. You must get vaccinated. Whether you're working on a federal site, whether you are working at an office that's not a federal site. As I said in the beginning, part of the goal of this is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. So even things that may not make sense, like at-home employees must be vaccinated, or people who are just in the office that don't do any direct federal work. Anybody who is federal contract adjacent must be vaccinated. So if you're an employee that works solely from home, under these rules, you have to be vaccinated. If you're someone in your home office who does accounting and payroll work for the company itself, even if you're not directly working on a federal contract, you have to be vaccinated. If you are working on the commercial side of your business, not on the federal side, if you're using the same garage, bathrooms, conference rooms, lunch rooms as your counterparts on the federal contracting side, you have to be vaccinated. Now, there are some things that are exceptions. One of them is a medical exception. The other is a sincerely held religious belief. And let's talk about both of those for a second. The medical exception is very much like any other Americans with Disabilities Act exemption for an accommodation that you might otherwise get under the ADA. You've got to get documentation from your doctor supporting why you need an exemption. Now, being pregnant, not an exemption. Living in a house with somebody who's immunocompromised, not an exemption. If you've just had a liver transplant, you can probably get an exemption. If you've just started chemotherapy, you can very likely get an exemption. But the core of this is it focuses on the employee individually, and it has to be something that under current rules is contraindicated for the vaccine. An allergy to the vaccine components would be workable. But saying, I don't like vaccines, I'm scared of vaccines, fear is not a medical exemption. And it will not work under these government rules. Sincerely held religious belief. This is another interesting one because really, how do you measure that? And it is a question of how does a company verify that? That's much more difficult because there isn't a set of rules like the ADA. So if you're a practicing Christian Scientist, for example, someone who has never gotten a vaccine, someone who doesn't believe in modern medicine as a pathway towards wellness, then, and that's commonly known, you've got a pretty good background to support a religious exemption. If you were raised Amish and are against vaccines, you've got a pretty good background for a religious exemption. But if you've gotten a whole bunch of other vaccines and you get your flu shot every year and you want to be religiously exempt from this one, that's considerably more problematical. Now, it's a minefield for companies. And unfortunately, this guidance puts the role of arbiter of exceptions down to the company level, except in a few cases where there are joint employment issues. If you have something like that, call us. We'll talk to you about it separately because those are few and far between. But you as a company have to make those decisions on whether or not someone is exempt. And then the last piece here is, what is the required proof? Well, they're not going to take attestations anymore. Attestations won't do it under these guidance points. You've got to have the CDC coronavirus vaccine card. You've got to have, if you don't have that, medical records, doctor's records. If you need to get a printout from the pharmacy or the doctor's office or the medical institution where you got it, it has to be a third-party record demonstrating that you've been vaccinated. So those are the rules on who and what. And what I'm going to do now is pass this over to my friend Kathy, and she's going to talk to you about some of the practicalities of implementing it in your workplace and how to best handle those situations. Then it'll be coming back to me, and I'm going to talk to you about masks and distancing. So the fun times never end when it comes to the coronavirus vaccine. Kathy, on to you.
Thank you, Andrew. You always crack me up. So as Andrew covered some really great topics in there and some information about who is required to get a vaccine and where are the lines beginning to be drawn. But as he said, those lines are ever evolving and moving. But so now that you know who is it covering, basically as you're a government contractor, pretty much everybody, how do you go about making sure that you are protected as the entity and the corporation? So the first thing we recommend to our clients is that you do a survey of your current work staff. What you need to know is who is already vaccinated, who has started the vaccination process, who is not vaccinated and willing to get vaccinated, and who is not vaccinated and not willing or unable to get vaccinated. That's going to give you a rough idea of where you stand with your workforce, so you know what you're dealing. Then you want to make sure that you have an updated COVID policy, and it's going to probably have to be updated consistently as you keep eyes on federal and state regulations. One of the things we're recommending is giving paid time off to your employees to go get vaccinated. Up to September 30th, that paid time off federally was a tax credit for you. Right now, we haven't heard about any extension of the federal tax credit for paid time off for getting the vaccine, but I am seeing state tax credits. Massachusetts just came out yesterday with one. So keep an eye on being able to get some sort of tax credit back for giving that time off. You're going to want to make sure that you rewrite your policies, as Andrew talked about, where you're very specific and clear about an ADA or religious exemption. And then you're going to need to let your employees know that you will be reviewing those on a case-by-case basis, and that as Andrew said, self-certification is no longer a valid point. They're going to need to have some sort of backup to whatever they're attesting to. Then you need to keep a confidential, eyes-only HR records place for all of these records that you're going to request, because you're going to have people's medical information on it and PII information. So you can do that electronically or you can do it paper version, but whatever you do, this should not be information that is shared with managers or executives, because this is considered health information and needs to stay inside the HR department. So Andrew mentioned several different types of vaccination documentation that your employee could provide. That's the documentation you're going to want to keep that is sensitive in nature. And then your last piece that you want to think about is reviewing your disciplinary measures for non-compliance. Are you going to, go to terminations? Are you going to go to layoffs? Are you going to try to find them other positions in the company if there's any availability to do that? But as Andrew points out, if you're sharing the same facilities, pretty hard to find another space for people to work. What are you going to want to put in your recruiting notices? Are you going to start saying in your recruiting notices and in your job descriptions that the vaccine is required? So I think if people start thinking of the vaccination requirement very much like a security clearance requirement, it will sort of help you align it HR-wise and corporate-wise with how it works in the government place. And then I think also pushing out to your employees convenient places to get vaccination, and then even creating incentives for employees to be vaccinated would help. But also, you should start talking to them about what we're starting to hear in the marketplace about penalties for not being vaccinated. We're hearing that some medical insurances are going to cause surcharges for not being vaccinated. We're hearing that there is some rumors on the street. These are all 100% rumors. I've got nothing yet concrete, that if you get terminated or you get laid off due to lack of vaccination, that they may not allow state unemployment insurance to cover you. So employees should be starting to be aware of all of the ramifications of any decisions that they make. And I think that's sort of the highlights I have, Andrew, on setting up your policies.
All right. Well, Kathy, thank you so much. And one other little thing to keep in mind is when you are explaining this to people, you also want to push it out on your website, in information that you're putting in RFPs. We are in compliance with this. Our employees will be complying with the rules, will be vaccinated, put it in job offers that you have out there. You're required to be, just like you said with security clearances, put it in RFPs that you're going to be compliant. It can only help you. There are folks who are putting their vaccination status on their resumes nowadays. Some of the big resume sites out there have tick boxes for it. So just something else to keep in mind there. So let's talk about masking and physical distancing. Right? We all got used to the idea of masking and physical distancing over the course of 2020. It eased up some in 2021, and now there are different sets of rules. What do you do inside versus outside? What do you do in a private office versus a common area? And in many ways, what do you do if you're vaccinated versus you're unvaccinated? And one of the big indicators that the government is using right now is something called the community transmission rate. They have categorized regions of the country into three different categories: low transmission, moderate transmission, and high transmission. This is something that you can find up on the web, and it should be checked at least a couple times a week by the company, because the area that you're in, which, low, medium, or high you're in, impacts what your employees have to do under this guidance. So let's talk about a high transmission area. The places that you've heard of, big cities, parts of Florida, parts of Texas, parts of California. If you're in a high transmission area, everyone is supposed to wear a mask indoors, vaccinated or unvaccinated. And if you are outdoors and have some reasonable distance between you, the vaccinated can go without a mask. The unvaccinated should be wearing a mask outdoors. Now, the exception to this is if you are in a defined closed environment. If you have a private office, you can take off your mask there. For short periods of eating or drinking, like you see in restaurants, you can take off your mask there. But in general, in high transmission areas, everyone should be masking up. Now, in low and medium transmission jurisdictions, those who are vaccinated do not have to wear masks, indoors or outdoors. Unvaccinated folks still have to wear masks indoors and in some outdoor settings if people are close together. But in a medium or low transmission jurisdiction, there's considerably more freedom, especially for the folks who have been vaccinated. So theoretically, if everyone follows this guidance, by the time November rolls around, people in low or moderate jurisdictions will be able to walk around without masks inside all the time because everyone will be vaccinated. Now, physical distancing. We all got used to that, seeing our kids' desks 6 feet apart and, sitting on opposite sides of the patio when family came to visit. For vaccinated folks, doesn't matter what kind of jurisdiction you're in, there is no need to distance. For the unvaccinated, you're supposed to stay a solid 6 feet away, and you should avoid communal areas like a lunchroom, like having a bunch of people in an elevator. And this also should apply to visitors. You should let visitors know these are the rules. And if they're not vaccinated, then you're going to be sitting 6 feet away from them. You are going to require all of your visitors to wear a mask. You are going to just follow those things as if it was May 2020 all over again. So, Kathy, I'm going to pass it to you. Maybe you can address some of the specifics of how best to, on the mechanics and logistics of this in the workplace. And then I'll be back to talk about designated implementation coordinators, another fun series of words that means a whole bunch of responsibilities that are going to be put on the business. So, Kathy, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. So when we talk about making sure that the information is shared both with your current employees as well as your visitors, some of the best suggestions or best practices that we're talking about is making sure you post signs in your workplace discussing on what your current mask policy is, on your front doors, in your lunchrooms, by your elevators, so everybody's aware of where you guys are. Because as Andrew pointed out, if you're in high transmission area, and that can change weekly, your rules and regulations could be very different than if you're in a low transmission area. And also, we're starting to see these policies change state by state. So as Andrew had pointed out before, what we're talking about right now is federal guidelines, but some states have superseding guidelines, which are greater than the federal requirements. So what may be applicable for your office in DC may not be applicable for your office in Virginia. So some of the things we want to talk about is posting signs on where your mask mandate is, making sure, I know it's kind of silly, but posting a picture or sign of actually how you're supposed to wear your mask, i.e. it should go over the nose and not under the nose. Post signs on required physical distancing, post signs on hand washing, sanitation, put out hand sanitation abilities in common areas. And then you also want to make sure that your employees are aware that any exception to wearing masks has to be approved in writing by HR, and it has to be reviewed, and we have to do a risk assessment to your other employees that are nearby you, as well as a sort of a risk assessment to the company before they do that. one thing I did kind of want to point out in doing all of this, as we were just talking, that on September 23rd, Virginia came out with a regulation that supersedes the federal mandate that says right now they're in a high risk area, and irregardless of the size, every employee has to wear a mask regardless of the vaccination. So it doesn't matter if you're a government contractor or you're over 100 employees. Every employee in Virginia now has to have employees wear masks inside their facility. So you want to make sure that you're aware of not only these federal mandates, but things that are going on within the state. So Andrew, I think those are the kind of the highlights on where you want to put your best practices in place on mask mandates.
Terrific. Thanks, Kathy. And I'd like to actually pick up on a couple of the things that you said. First off, you may have a job, an employee who, because of their job, can't easily wear a fabric mask, right? Maybe you are a painter and you've got breathing gear on. Maybe you're working underwater where wearing a paper mask would be foolish. Those are exceptions that are common sense exceptions. However, like Kathy said, you've got to have something in writing that says that exception has been granted by the management of the company. I know it seems ridiculous and I know it seems redundant, but based on the rules as written, that's something you're going to have to do. So for all you folks out there who have scuba divers on your payroll, keep that in mind. And then another thing, so let's talk about state and local laws for 2 seconds. Kathy touched on it, that Virginia, and there are plenty of other states, have laws that supersede this, that require more than what the federal guidance says. And in this federal guidance, it specifically says if your state requires more, then the state wins and you've got to comply with it. However, it also says if your state requires less, you've got to comply with the federal guidance. So if you're in a state that has a mask ban or something like that, you have to follow that federal guidance. And if your state is more strict, then you've got to follow the more strict guidance that is out there. So let's talk about the third prong of this, the designated implementation coordinator. This guidance specifically says that there has to be a person in the company who is the point person for this. What do they have to do? They've got to oversee compliance and implementation of all of this stuff we've been telling you this morning. Now, can it be more than one person? Sure. You could have one person who's in charge, and then you could have one person at each different site. Because, as Kathy said, it's different from place to place. Rules in Maryland are different than rules in Idaho or Wisconsin or Virginia. So if you have a large grouping of employees in different states, it's a good idea to have a sub-designated implementation coordinator who reports up to somebody. But the buck stops with someone, and you've got to figure out who that is, because that person has to get the word out. That person has to handle the implementation. They've got to push the compliance and call people out who aren't doing it. Now, it would make sense to have that as a member of your HR team. If you're going to be collecting vaccination information, it could also make sense to have it a member of your on-site team if you're tracking mask usage and the like. But the important thing is you've got to put this all on paper, who's responsible, what their duties are, and how they're going to do it. And when it comes to, again, the mechanics of how to do this, I'm going to pass the buck to Kathy one more time and let her run with it. After that, we're going to take some questions from you. So get those questions in over the YouTube chat. Kevin is furiously going through things to curate them, and he will start asking questions, and Kathy and I will do the best we can to reply.
Thanks, Andrew. So back to best practices on some of the things that Andrew was talking about. So we recommend doing a designated safety committee because, as Andrew pointed out, some people like HR are going to be collecting private information, but they may not be on site to be able to enforce mask mandates and who's wearing mandates. So we recommend a committee. That way, if somebody, God forbid, gets COVID themselves or is out sick, you have other people that can step in and help with the process. And we need to make sure that that committee does all the protocols for contract placing, reporting, gathering of information, proof of vaccination, returning to work guidelines, self-reporting, testing, all the fun things that are wrapped up into this. Then you also need to designate a person to coordinate the COVID-19 workplace safety efforts, which is somebody on site that helps coordinate the cleaning, the sanitizing of the building and the workspaces, the providing of the protective gear. If somebody forgot their masks, where did they go to get a mask? Any sort of contact tracing. So if you have an outbreak in your office, majority of the states require you to start reporting it, including contact tracing. So in most cases, that's 2 positive cases in a workplace. Then you have to start contact tracing and you have to start reporting it to the Department of Health. And then you also want to encourage your employees to self-report and monitor, and what is the process and policy for that. And then the last thing is the majority of the states are requiring some sort of written document for a preparedness plan and training to explain to your employees how to do the COVID self-reporting, what do they have to, how they wear their masks, what are the rules and regulations, so that the employees can't say, well, I didn't know and I didn't understand. And that's kind of the highlights on implementing the responsible parties. Remember, at the end of the day, you're going to be trying to solve and answer to 2 different groups of people during this entire process. One, your employees, trying to make sure they understand the requirements and trying to keep them safe. But 2, also the organization. You don't want to end up having all sorts of OSHA problems or other problems because you had an unsafe workplace compared to COVID after these regulations.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. Gosh, we had over 50 questions pre-submitted before the webinar even began here. And so I'm going to put some of these to both of you, and we'll kind of bounce around and talk through them all. Here's one that's really, really straightforward, submitted by Shannon. When is all of this due to be compliant? When does everybody have to get started with this?
Well, the sooner the better, because these requirements are indicating that everyone has to be fully vaccinated, which means you've gotten both shots and you've had 2 weeks after that for those vaccinations to kick in, or again, the 1 shot with J&J. And I believe that has got to be done by December 4th, 5th. So the sooner the better. Give me a second.
Excellent.
I'll look that up as you're asking Kathy the next question.
Well, and I did want to follow up on that. I am hearing from the government contracting side that any modifications issued in the new year will be including this requirement, and the contracting officer will be forcing it through the contract itself. And there is discussions in going back and modding historical contracts as well to add this FAR clause. I believe it's going to be a FAR clause or a statement of addition to statement of work. I'm not quite sure where they're going to put it in the contract, but I have heard that from a contracting perspective, they are going to start pushing the requirement in the written contract and outside of just announcing this regulation.
And that's absolutely right. It's going to be written into all new contracts, all recompetes and renewals. And yeah, the question out there is what happens on legacy ones, but they're going to find a way to do it because clearly one of the goals here is to just get people vaccinated as soon as possible. The deadline for being fully vaccinated, I just looked it up, it was December 8th. So go 2 weeks prior to December 8th, and you're looking at people getting their second shot sometime prior to Thanksgiving.
Excellent.
Typically 30 days in between both shots, which means your first shot needs to be prior to Halloween.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you to you both. And this kind of follows along those same lines. This is a question coming in from Courtney. Do FSS, GSA, ECAT, and DAPA contract holders count as holding a federal contract for the purpose of what we're talking about here today?
Well, right now, this guidance is not that specific, but I would say anybody, if the money originates with the federal government, that this will apply to them, because not only do prime contractors have to do this, they're required to roll down these requirements to all of their subcontractors as well. And as I said, anything that's GovCon adjacent is very likely going to have this imposed upon them. There will be updates coming out. There will be agency-specific material coming out. It just hasn't yet, and we're waiting to see, just like everyone else.
I would
Sounds
say
good.
that
Thanks, Andrew.
I'm sorry. I would say that Andrew said the right exact phrase, which is if you've accepted $1 from the federal government through a contracting vehicle, either as a prime or a sub, this is going to apply to you. There's not going to be an out based by GSA or DARPA or anything else. And I'm pretty confident, along with Andrew, that they're aligning it with all federal funds.
Gotcha. No, it makes absolute sense. I'm going to put this one to you, Kathy, because this is regarding hiring new employees. When you're hiring a new person, do you as the HR director, does the HR director have the ability to just ask them outright during the interview phase there if they've been vaccinated or not? Or are you waiting till an offer letter's been extended and accepted, then inquiring?
Well, I think you have to ask during the interviewing process. If you're uncomfortable with asking, are you vaccinated or not? A better way of putting the question is to say, here are some core responsibilities of this job, i.e. you must have a facility clearance, i.e. you must be vaccinated, i.e. and then ask the employee, do you have any issues with the core responsibilities of this job? Are you able to meet the core requirements of this job and the timing that is required? And then allow the employee to expand. That way, if they say, well, I feel like I have an ADA exception, or if I'm not currently vaccinated, but I could get vaccinated by the time this job starts, sort of thing, allows them to expand on whatever the answer is without you being like so specific in the question.
Circling back to the religious exemption part of that process, let's assume that same person there declares that they would like a religious exemption. The question is, what type of documentation as an employer do I have to ask for to document said exemption?
Well, like I said earlier, a religious exemption is tough because there is no hard and fast set of rules that has been passed down in a lot of religions regarding vaccinations. It's not like, the avoidance of pork that you find with Muslims and Jewish folks. It's not like certain holidays that are celebrated that have been on the calendar for thousands of years. With the exception of folks like Christian Scientists who have actively eschewed, quote unquote, modern medicine, it's very hard to justify. So it's really going to come down to a case-by-case analysis of what can the employee present and what supporting documentation they have. If they just assert, hey, it's against my religion, I think it's going to be a lot more of an uphill climb without an explanation. Just like saying, oh, well, I've got a medical reason that I can't do it, but without any proof from a physician.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. Great question in here from Tom Davis here. Could you share your thoughts on high-risk pregnancies in regards to the vaccine? If somebody is claiming that, a high-risk pregnancy is at play, does that fall into the category of a possible exemption?
As of right now, a pregnancy alone does not, even if it's a high-risk one. It has been strongly recommended by the CDC, and the current guidance from the CDC is that pregnant women be vaccinated. So a high-risk pregnancy, unless there is a co-occurring situation, like someone is immunosuppressed, someone has cancer, someone has lupus, something along that line, pregnancy alone would not do it under this guidance.
Got it. Thanks, Andrew. Here's one for Kathy. So if an employee just outright fails to provide proof of vaccination or just refuses the vaccination there, is it 100% that we're going to have to terminate that employee in order to be compliant and keep the contract with the federal government?
So unfortunately, I don't see any other way around it. It would be to me very much like, again, if you have contracts that have all security clearances and somebody fails to maintain their security clearance, they lose it or they can't get it. You don't have a place to employ them. I think the key here and the decision that's going to have to be made by the employers are you going to treat this as a termination, meaning fault of the employee and no longer eligible for unemployment insurance in the majority of states? Or are you going to treat it like a layoff, meaning I can't have you work at this client and I don't have any other work for you, so therefore I'm going to lay you off, and you would have the eligibility for unemployment insurance, pending how states are going to approach people refusing to get COVID vaccines with no exceptions, and if they're still going to be eligible for unemployment insurance at that point in time. That's still all up in the air, but assuming all regulations that there are right now stand, that employee would be eligible for unemployment. Whatever you choose to do, you need to be consistent in your inconsistencies, meaning that if you say all employees who refuse to get this are going to be terminated for cause and they're going to have that on their record, then that's what you need to do for all employees. If you say, I'm going to go ahead and lay off all employees and let them, go ahead and move forward and get unemployment insurance, and they're going to be marked as a layoff in your HR records, that's fine too. That's sort of a personal choice, a hard approach versus more of a soft approach. But whatever you do, you've got to be consistent across the employee population.
Terrific. Thanks, Kathy. Let's change the topic up for a moment here. Let's talk about HIPAA here. We have a great question that came in. What, if any, impact does HIPAA have on an employer's right to ask an employee for information on their vaccination status? And how much detail should an employer be asking for?
Okay, well, HIPAA was designed to protect an individual's health information from being disseminated by third parties. So there's absolutely no HIPAA violation at all if I, as your boss, someone who is the implementation coordinator or HR or whatever, ask you directly about your own medical information. Right? And there's HIPAA isn't even implicated there because you, as the employee, are being asked directly about your medical situation. Now, where HIPAA could be involved is when the employer is certifying to the federal government or the prime contractor that they are in compliance. What you can't do is say, well, we're all in compliance except Kevin, who didn't get a vaccine. That would be a violation of HIPAA. But you could say, we're in compliance. There were two people who weren't, and we laid them off. Without naming any names, you don't have to worry about HIPAA being infringed. As to what you need from an employee, well, that's something that I touched on earlier, as did Kathy. You've got to have that coronavirus vaccine card or a medical record, a hospital record, some type of outside third-party record that demonstrates that you have gotten vaccinated. And every place that's given you a shot, that's given anyone a shot, is required under the CDC rules to keep track of whom they have given shots to, what date they did so, and which vaccine they got. So go back to the place where you got the shot, and you can pull a record of it if you've lost that little card that, is still small enough to lose, but too big to fit in a normal wallet.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
Is there a case to be made by an employee or a potential hire who says, I had COVID, they can prove they had COVID, and I have antibodies inside me here. And science says, depending upon who you read, that antibodies provide some level of protection, be it higher or lower, depending upon who you talk to. They're then a vaccine. Is there any ground that employee has to stand on?
No, there isn't. Not under this guidance. Because, as I said, the twin goals here are both improving the safety in federal workplaces and forcing as many people to get vaccinated as possible. So the I've had coronavirus argument and I've got antibodies will not do it. In fact, in the FAQ that comes with the guidance, it specifically asks, hey, if I have an antibody test that shows I have a bunch of antibodies, do I still have to get vaccinated? The answer is bright, clear, and in bold letters, yes, you still have to get vaccinated.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's pretty clear then. In talking about subcontractors here for a minute now, all right? A lot of our clients, many federal contractors, of course, employ subs to do all different types of work. The question is, from an HR perspective, whom should we seek proof of our subcontractors' vaccinations? Are we going to the subcontractor, him or herself, or are we going to the subcontractor employee to get a list, so to speak, en masse of all of the individuals who are on the job site? Can you guys speak to that for a minute?
Sure. You should not, as a prime contractor, be reaching down to your subcontractors' employees. You don't have the right or the authority to do so, even under this guidance. You are contracted with this company to provide whatever services they are under that subcontract. Part of those services, part of that contract, has to be compliance with federal rules. We see flow downs in everything from, workplace rules to insurance, and these are required to be flowed down. So the burden is on the subcontractor to find out from each of their employees, and then for them to warrant up the chain here that they are okay to work and in compliance with these rules.
Sounds good. Thank you, Andrew. Shifting gears here for another minute over to the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act under the American Rescue Plan. That actually expired yesterday. Has there been any talk of an extension of that plan and pushing that out further?
I've heard talk of it. Unfortunately, I think it got lost in the whole let's pass the budget and not go upside down on our debt ceiling. So I'd be interested to see when they get the budget piece settled, if they do not repass that or extend it and retroactivate it back. But right now it's unknown on the federal level. I am, as I said, seeing certain states starting to step up and offer it on the state level. Massachusetts just announced yesterday that they would be offering a tax credit for the paid time off. And so we can start to see if other states follow suit and offer it at the state level. But as of right now, it is expired and we don't know if they're going to extend it. I would think that they probably would, but then we all know that logic has no place in the federal government contracting.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy. And again, along those same lines there with an employer now, are employers required to pay for time off for an employee to get the vaccine, to be able to recover from potentially getting the vaccine? Will there be a tax credit for the employer to provide that paid time off there?
So as of right now, all of that, those options that were there have expired. We do recommend that you at least offer paid time off to have them get the vaccine. And let me sort of be clear here. Part of this is going to be about what type of employee you have. So if you have a salaried employee and that salaried employee works any part of that week or any part of that day, you still have to pay them for the full day. Now, you could require them to take PTO if they weren't there at all. And they could say, well, no, I had to go get a shot that you said was part of work. So therefore it's part of my scope of work. So I shouldn't have to take PTO. And you could start getting into a fight over the nuances of that. So it's sort of our recommendation that you go ahead and give them the paid time off to go get the shot. If they're hourly employees, that's not a legal requirement about the whole work week. They get paid the hours they work. But again, you really want to encourage these employees to go ahead and get the shot. I'm sure, as many small businesses can attest to right now, hiring is difficult. The workforce is thin, and trying to get the right people aboard seems to be harder than normal. So I think the last thing you want to do is make it harder for your employees to get the shot and have to lay them off and then have to try to backfill those people.
Thanks, Kathy. It's probably a legal question here. As part of 14042 there, the new executive regulations, is there any provisions in there that provide legal shield, indemnification, liability, et cetera, for employers as part of this process, given the fact that, arguably you could say they're building the airplane as they're flying it as we speak?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. They are building it as they're flying it. The administration's first goal was to get the rules out there that will apply to as many folks as possible. And then I think what we're going to be seeing over the next few weeks is refinement of those rules. Talking about, as someone brought up earlier, are folks who in DARPA going to be required to get this? Are folks in NGOs or folks who have government grants going to have these rules imposed upon them? We don't know the answer to that yet. And some of the operational and mechanical issues like indemnification, like workers' comp, like, the scarlet letter people will have to wear for not being vaccinated, those things are not in place yet. So unfortunately, Kevin, I can't give you a clear answer. The answer is going to be wait and see, because at this point, they've built the plane. It has wings, but it doesn't have seats or engines. Somehow still flying, but it needs a ways to go.
Well, I'm looking forward to the day when it has cocktails. So on board. So along those same lines, Andrew, though, a lot of Capital Group clients carry robust amounts of coverage for EPLI, employment practice liability insurance, the type of coverage that you have just in case you get sued by an employee. Again, the guidance on this is still very unclear from an insurance company's perspective, because this just came out a week or so ago. But how are you looking at it from an insurance carrier's perspective if litigation is brought by an employee against an employer here? Are we going to have coverage under EPLI?
Sure. That's a great question. And we don't know that either. But here's a few things we do know. First, EPLI is there to protect you against discrimination and harassment. Now, this guidance carries the weight of a federal law, and companies are obligated to follow federal law. Hence, it's very hard to say I'm being discriminated against because I'm being asked to follow this law. Now, where could it show up? If somebody is denied a medical exemption or a religious exemption, a discrimination case could certainly be made there. This guidance goes to great trouble to say you treat medical exemptions the same way you do ADA requests for accommodation. And those are absolutely covered by most EPLI policies. The other question we got to ask is talk to your EPLI folks, because, and we're getting into the weeds a little bit here on insurance, some of them have what's called a duty to defend. So you may have to, as an EPLI carrier, at least defend in cases like this. But we are waiting for updated guidance, updated endorsements from EPLI carriers. And you can bet that if you're coming up for renewal, then in your renewal policy, there's going to be some policy language that specifically addresses how to handle the coronavirus situation and what is and is not excluded.
Awesome. Great thoughts there, Andrew. This is more of an esoteric question here for debate for both Kathy and Andrew. Why can a COVID vaccine be required by the federal government, but arguably other vaccines that address more dangerous illnesses?
Well, I guess I'll start if that's okay, Kathy.
Oh,
I think there are a couple components of it. First is how quickly this particular bug spreads. And, we saw how rapidly it took over the world in 2020. And some of the other things out there are considerably more rare and considerably more difficult to spread. And then I think there is also a component of an abundance of caution to reassure a lot of the people who are just frightened of this disease, this condition, that, hey, if you go into a federal workplace, it will be an environment that is safer for you than in a non-federal environment where you don't know whether or not people have gotten vaccinated.
Terrific. You want to share any thoughts with us on that from your end, Kathy? Or
Sure. So I would say that what is attempting to happen here is to get an entire population as close to vaccination as possible. So you have a couple of things going on. One, there are vaccines that are required. We just require them at the child age to be able to go to school. And that's not possible right now because we need the entire population to be vaccinated, not just the young kids. And I think the second thing is, I think there's some, as Andrew said, caution about where is this going to mutate to, right? If we can't get a handle on this, and we're seeing these mutations that are coming out that are either are more deadly, or they're able to spread faster, or they attack younger groups and people without prior existing conditions. If we don't take this opportunity to try to get as many people as vaccinated as possible, what happens if this mutates to something where the mortality rate's 20% or 30%, and we had an opportunity to stop it? So I also think part of this is, how bad could this get? And let's try to make sure we don't get there.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin, if you were going to be asking questions like that, we should have invited Dr. Fauci on this call as well.
well, you're at least as smart as Dr. Fauci, Andrew. Come on.
Well, he's at least funnier, for sure.
Another question that we got, and maybe this will clear up any confusion that might be there regarding the size of employers there and how that pertains to federal contractors. 100 was mentioned in the executive order as the size of an employer where you need vaccinations or not for it. Impacts to federal employers above and below that. Can you talk to that for a second?
Sure. It's real easy. If you are a federal contractor, you must be vaccinated. I don't care if you have 2 people. I don't care if you have 20,000. When the president was announcing this, you got to look at it as there was one set of rules for federal contractors, and that is everyone has to be vaccinated. And then the next set of rules, which they would like to implement through OSHA, but there currently isn't guidance or rules done on that yet, is commercial companies that are over 100 employees. So that's a completely different set. Who knows? We'll probably have a webinar on that too in a few weeks once the guidance comes out. But for right now, if you're a federal contractor, doesn't matter how big you are, you have to be vaccinated under these rules and under this guidance.
So, Andrew, I have a follow-up question for your thought process here. And that is, how and where do you think government contractors should be handling their 1099s, right? So a 1099, you're not flowing down your FAR clauses and an entire subcontract to them. So how do you think if they have 1099s working as labor on a contract, they should handle that? And is that any different than a vendor that provides, some sort of, graphic artist support on a contract where there's no really labor, but there's a deliverable? And no sub-K was also issued in that case.
Sure. That's a great question. So vendors are not specifically addressed. So if you're delivering paper clips to a government contractor, that is not currently mandated in here. However, if you are a 1099, you are in essence a subcontractor. You might not be a company, but you are a subcontractor. That money is arising from a government contract. And especially if you are working in the office, if you are working on a federal site, you've got to be vaccinated. Okay. If you are a 1099 who's acting more as a vendor, like you said, a graphic designer who just, puts together some nice visuals for a PowerPoint and never actually comes in contact with any government folks, I don't know. It's a gray area. I would say that under the documentation that exists as of now, they probably will have to, because clearly the administration is trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. Under common sense, maybe not. I just don't know the answer to that, and we're going to be waiting for some refinement. But real clear, if you're a 1099 who's working on a government site or a 1099 who is in the corporate office, you have to be vaccinated.
Okay.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Andrew. Well, we got time for one more question here, and maybe I'll take the answer on this one. The question is, while all of this is being implemented and set up from an employer's perspective there, can we as the employer have a surcharge placed upon unvaccinated employees for the cost of their health care? And the answer right now is yes, you can. We actually have clients who have already started to do that pre-Biden executive order there in order to kind of bring that pressure to bear to get folks vaccinated. And quite frankly, the plan itself doesn't want to be responsible for COVID-related claims in the unvaccinated employee population there. So that makes perfect sense. But we're right at the top of the hour, 10:59. I'd like to take a moment to thank our panelists today. Wonderful, robust discussion. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks for everyone for sticking with us for the full hour. We have a busy fall coming up. Our next webinar date is going to be released here in the next week or so. And it's going to be discussing strategies around those folks who have a Service Contract Act. Going to be a Service Contract Act 101, 102 class. We're going to have some really good subject matter experts on the line. So, well, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone enjoys a wonderful weekend, and looking forward to seeing everyone sometime in the near future. Thank you.